Thank you very much indeed, Desmond. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 15 years after the glorious defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, James I came to the throne of England in 1603 and soon concluded a peace treaty with the Spaniards. He then sought to consolidate it and receive an enormous dowry for the impoverished royal coffers by marrying his eldest son Henry to Anna, the daughter of King Philip III of Spain. After Henry's untimely death in 1612, attention turned to a marriage between his brother Charles, now Prince of Wales, egged on by Steenie Buckingham. An intended marriage with Anna's younger sister, the Infanta Maria Anna. The Spanish marriage, or match, was not a popular policy in England. As Rushworth wrote later in the 17th century, the people of England, having yet in memory the intended cruelty of 1588 and hating the popish religion, generally hated this match. Negotiations for a new Spanish marriage stalled in early 1623, ostensibly about the rights for Catholics in England to worship and avoid persecution, but in reality about the Spanish refusal to countenance the restitution of the Palatinate to James I's Protestant son-in-law. They culminated the negotiations in the fiasco of Charles I and Buckingham's moonlit flit to Madrid to win the Infanta's hand in person and bring her back to England. Their secret journey, disguised with false beards and travelling as Mr. John and Mr. Thomas Smith, with only 2 courtiers, was high diplomatic drama, but ultimately a diplomatic disaster. The journey itself started badly when one of the false beards fell off at Gravesend. As this current exhibition has demonstrated so superbly, one of the few positive and lasting effects of Charles's stay in Madrid was his exposure to the works of art in the Spanish Royal Collection and the gifts of paintings he received and bought. This part of the Spanish match story is well known. Less well known is the role that art connoisseurs and collectors played as royal diplomats in the marriage negotiations and the events surrounding them, both in Madrid and Rome. George Gage, Toby Matthew, Endymion Porter, and Kenelm Digby. This paper will cover briefly the diplomatic roles they played. It will show how these men were so close and so core to Charles and Buckingham's business, in royal affairs as well as in the world of art, and how these 4 were closely connected to the young Van Dyck and 4 famous pictures he painted in Rome during the Spanish match negotiations. George Gage is best known to art historians for his friendship with Rubens and as a connoisseur, assisting with the acquisitions of Charles, Sir Dudley Carleton, and the Earl of Arundel. The proposed marriage between a Protestant Prince of Wales with a Catholic Infanta required a special dispensation from the Pope. From 1621 until the end of the negotiations, the end of 1623, George Gage was James I's agent to Pope Gregory XV. Gage was based in Rome and travelled to London and Madrid. If the Infanta had arrived in London as Charles's wife, it is recorded that Gage would likely have become her secretary. The state papers and other contemporary sources confirmed that Gage was not a mere messenger of James I, but given considerable scope to conduct personal negotiations with the Pope and his cardinals. He was, in fact, a secret Catholic priest and had been ordained in Rome in June 1614 by Cardinal Bellarmine along with his great friend and close companion, Toby Matthew. According to the letter writer John Chamberlain, Toby Matthew and George Gage were inseparable friends, and Gage was Matthew's fidus Achates, faithful friend and devoted follower. And Matthew, leaving all his worldly possessions to the younger Gage in a will, called him my dearest friend in the entire world. Toby Matthew was a former Member of Parliament and a prominent Catholic convert. He was banished twice from England. Remarkably, he was the son of the Archbishop of York. Lord Thomas Fairfax once found the Archbishop looking melancholy and asked him the reason. "My lord," said the Archbishop, "I have reason of great sorrow with respect of my sons, one of whom has wit and no grace, another grace but not wit, and the third neither grace nor wit." By all contemporary accounts, Toby Matthew certainly had wit. Whilst in exile on the continent, he and Gage became great friends with Antwerp's artistic world. They also met the Earl of Arundel and Inigo Jones in Italy in 1614. And it was Toby Matthew who wrote to Dudley Carleton in November 1620, with the news of Van Dyck's going to England and the king having given him a pension of £100 a year. Redeemed by Buckingham and brought back from exile, and secretly employed by James for the negotiations, Matthew travelled between Spain, France, and England in 1621 to 1623. He joined Charles and Buckingham in Madrid in May 1623, 6 weeks after they had arrived. He was knighted by the king in October of that year on their return to England from Madrid, though his secret role was not widely known in the country. As John Chamberlain wrote to Dudley Carleton, "Toby Matthew was knighted at Royston not long since, but for what service, God knows." Endymion Porter was another courtier, collector, and connoisseur who was fluent in Spanish. As a young man, he had served in the embassy in Madrid, and also the household of the powerful chamberlain to the Spanish court, Count Olivares. Back in England, he was serving in the household of the then Marquis of Buckingham in 1623. 5 months before Charles and Buckingham took off for Madrid in their moonlit flit, Porter had been sent to Madrid to push the pace of the negotiations. When Charles and Buckingham did ride secretly to Madrid themselves, they took only 2 men with them for the journey: Francis Cottington, a former ambassador to Spain and the secretary to Charles, and Endymion Porter. Porter remained with Charles and Buckingham throughout their 8-month stay, and doubtless accompanied them to view the paintings in the Spanish Royal Collection. Also in Madrid, when the party arrived in 1623, was Kenelm Digby, attached to the embassy of his cousin, John Digby, Earl of Bristol, ambassador to the King of Spain. Kenelm Digby had met Van Dyck in Italy in 1622. Digby proved himself indispensable in the royal dealings with the Spanish court. He was also knighted by King James in late 1623 on his return from Madrid, not shortly after Toby Matthew received his knighthood. These 4 men, acting as royal diplomats, were well known as great connoisseurs above all. Porter, Digby, and Matthew were all on Edmund Bolton's list for membership of the Royal Academy, which he proposed to King James I in 1624. Matthew and Gage were also involved in the first proposed decorations for Inigo Jones's banqueting house and the approaches to Rubens in 1620-1621. They were all friends with the young Van Dyck, and in the case of Porter and Digby, probably his closest friends in England during his second stay in the court from 1632 to his death in 1641. Digby and Van Dyck dabbled in alchemy together. The portrait of Endymion Porter in the present exhibition was painted by Van Dyck in 1628, when Porter was in Brussels on diplomatic business and buying paintings for Charles from Van Dyck at the same time. However, Endymion Porter and an even younger Van Dyck had known each other from Van Dyck's first stay in England, from October 1620 to at least February 1621. A docket on behalf of the Duke of Buckingham in the State Papers Domestic, not dated, but in a sheaf of documents from 1620, records a payment by Porter to the picture drawer Van Dyck, amount and reason undecipherable. It is yet to be proven whether the young Van Dyck played any direct role himself around the Spanish Match negotiations. However, Fiorenzo Rangoni's recent Roman archival discovery, published in this January's Burlington magazine, has revealed that Van Dyck lived with George Gage in Rome between 1621 and 1623. Confirmation of the close friendship between Van Dyck and Gage in Rome can be found in the subsequent dedication of Luscus Vorstermann's engraving of Van Dyck's Lamentation, which Van Dyck painted on his return to Antwerp after 1627. The translation of the dedication from the Latin reads, "To Mr. George Gage, most highly regarded amongst the English as a lasting token of mutual sympathy once established in the eternal city, and of the same affection now." All this adds fuel to the speculation that Van Dyck's payment of £100 for special service from James I in February 1621 was for diplomatic rather than artistic services. Several surveyors of the King or Queen's pictures have searched in vain for any royal portraits or copies of other artists' paintings of the royal family by Van Dyck during his first stay in England. This payment of £100 for special service was followed shortly by a Privy Council pass to travel for 8 months. Interestingly, as well as living with Gage in Rome, Van Dyck also travelled in Italy with the Countess of Arundel and her train. The Countess, who was Catholic and married to the great collector, the Earl of Arundel, was on standby to travel from Genoa to Madrid to accompany the Infanta to England from Spain when the marriage negotiations had been successfully concluded. It is possible that Van Dyck would have travelled with her, perhaps to paint a portrait of the Infanta, the royal bride-to-be, or perhaps, as Rubens was to prove in the peace negotiations in 1628-29, to be a valuable addition to royal diplomatic efforts through his knowledge of languages and easy acceptance in royal courts as a portrait painter. Speculative though this may be, new research is certainly revealing new findings and previously unknown links between Van Dyck and the players in the Spanish Match, and in particular with regards to 4 spectacular and famous paintings executed during Van Dyck's sojourn in Rome. The first is a proposed identification of the art dealer in the portrait of George Gage with 2 men in the National Gallery. Hilary Madicott has recently published conclusive proof in the British Art Journal that the gentleman on the left is indeed George Gage. The painting was once owned by Sir Joshua Reynolds, portrait painter and first president of the Royal Academy. Reynolds added a note in his copy of Walpole's Anecdotes of Painting in England about this picture, recording that the man on the right bringing in the small statue is Martin van der Enden. Dr. Madicott rightly points out that Martin van den Enden, the Antwerp printer and publisher, best known for producing the first edition of Van Dyck's iconography, would have been too young to have been the secondary figure in the painting, as he was born in 1605. However, if it is indeed a Van den Enden, and perhaps the identification by Reynolds comes from an old inscription on the canvas or frame, now lost, then there is a strong possibility that it represents Ferdinand van den Enden. Ferdinand van den Enden was an Antwerp-born art dealer active in Rome and Naples in the 1620s. He was born in 1584, which makes him around the right age for the art dealer in the painting. He died in Rome in 1630, and the Flemish sculptor Francis du Quesnoy, a friend of Van Dyck's, designed and executed his tomb in the church of Santa Maria dell'Anima. One of Van Dyck's best-known Rome portraits is this magnificent canvas of Cardinal Guido Bentivoglio, now in the Pitti Palace, and there is a later copy in the Royal Collection. Bentivoglio returned to Rome in February 1621 and was made a cardinal, having been a successful papal nuncio, envoy, in first Flanders and then France from 1607 to 1621. Van Dyck's early biographer Ballory suggested in 1672 that Van Dyck had stayed with Bentivoglio in Rome. On our project, we have discovered previously unremarked letters that show that Bentivoglio was an intimate friend with Toby Matthew, and therefore George Gage, and most likely Van Dyck. His letters, published in Italian and translated into English and French after his death in 1645, include two intimate epistles to Matthew in 1620 from Paris, addressing him as "my dear Toby," and dwelling on their mutual affection. A planned examination of the Bentivoglio papers in the Vatican archives will hopefully reveal whether it is Matthew who wrote to the cardinal as "mon cher cousin," which can be seen on the envelope in the painting. Another portrait, or rather pair of portraits, resplendent with colour, are the paintings of the Persian ambassador Sir Robert Shirley and his Circassian wife Theresia. It is recorded that the Shirleys were in Rome between the 22nd of July and the 29th of August 1622. Little recorded, though, is the fact that the Shirleys had arrived in Rome from Madrid, where Robert Shirley had been in residence as ambassador since 1617, when the entire negotiations were being conducted for a Spanish match. And he arrived in Rome from Madrid bearing messages related to the Spanish match to Pope Gregory XV. It turns out that the Shirleys were also on intimate terms with Toby Matthew and George Gage, and that in a previous tenure in Madrid from 1609 to 1611, when Matthew and Gage lived there, they are recorded as constant guests at the Shirleys' table. Also, it has been generally overlooked that, adventurer abroad though he was, Robert Shirley was well connected with the court of James I. The king used to stay with his sister and brother-in-law, Sir John Crofts, at Saxon Parva in Suffolk. When the Shirley's son Henry was born in 1611, he was not only named after Charles's elder brother, but Prince Henry also stood godfather to the child. Much of Robert Shirley's first embassy to James I between 1611 and 1613 was concerned with promoting the trade of silks between Persia and England. So too was his second embassy to England after he had left Rome from December 1623 to the end of 1625. A recent re-examination of two sources suggests that this beautiful portrait of Lady Shirley may well have been in Charles I's collection, he or James I having been gifted it by Sir Robert Shirley. When I mentioned this possibility to Jost van der Aare, Jost rightly pointed out that there could be no better advertisement for the silk trade than Lady Shirley's opulent dress and the accompanying draperies. And it is recorded that in 1624, the King, Prince Charles and Buckingham were considering funding 6 merchant ships to go to Persia themselves. The first source we examined is George Virtue's transcript of Van der Dort's catalogue of Charles I's collection in the Ashmolean Museum. The original Van der Dort catalogue can be seen in the exhibition. The transcript was published after Virtue had died by Batho in 1757 and records on page 163, number 18, the Lady Shirley in fantastic habit, supposed to be a Persian habit, by Van Dyck. There is a curious note about the 26 items on the list, of which this is number 18. It states that number 1 should follow number 38, earlier in the catalogue. It leads me to believe that these 26 items were listed on a separate manuscript sheet, which was inserted into the catalogue and has subsequently been lost, as the paintings do not appear in Oliver Miller's 1960 Walpole Society publication of Abraham van der Dort's catalogue of the collection of Charles I. This list of 26 appears to be a list of gifts to the royal collection, including jewels, wax modellos, paintings, and a picture of the Queen in silk. Named donors include the ambassadors Lord Cottington, Lord Dorchester, the French ambassador, and the ambassador of the United States, the Dutch United Provinces. A painting of Lady Shirley at length in a fantastic habit does appear in Miller's 1972 The Inventories and the Valuations of the King's Goods, compiled for their sale during the Commonwealth. It is listed as being in the Queen's Gallery at Greenwich as number 131. Except for one painting, the Lady Ruthven by Van Sommer, artist names are not given for the remaining 34 portraits in the Queen's Gallery. The painting of Lady Shirley was sold for £6 to Murray, the King's tailor. Murray bought many paintings in the Commonwealth sale, often at knockdown prices. One would hope that as a tailor, he would have particularly appreciated the rendering of the silk clothes. It is worth noting that Robert and Teresia Shirley's niece, Cecilia, was a maid of honour to Queen Henrietta Maria. So, it is an intriguing thought that Lady Shirley's portrait might have been gifted to the royal collection and possibly commissioned from Van Dyck in Rome for such a purpose. Which brings me to Van Dyck's painting of Susanna and the Elders in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. Previously, art historians had argued as to whether this painting had been done in the artist's first Antwerp period or in Italy. It is now firmly placed in the Italian period, and I would now like to place it in Rome in 1622 and propose an identification of the model. The resemblance is so remarkable and the facial features so distinctive that Van Dyck's model for Susanna must surely be Lady Shirley. Susanna may be a sensual beauty, but she is nevertheless and foremost a chaste woman in the Old Testament, when resisting the advances of the two elderly and lecherous scribes. This description well fits with the redoubtable and beautiful Lady Shirley, who is described by a contemporary, Sir Thomas Herbert, as the thrice worthy and undaunted Lady Teresia, his faithful wife, and the survivor of several assassination attempts on her, husband, and herself in both India and Persia. We can confirm in Erik Larsson's 1988 reference to a Susanna in the collection of the wealthy Flemish merchant, shipowner, and art collector Gaspar de Ruma in Naples is correct. The painting is mentioned in the 1634 book Il Forastiero Dialoghi di Julio Cesare Carpaccio by the Neapolitan theologian, historian, and poet of the same name. He was the man who coined the phrase, "See Naples and die." We have also discovered that a possible second Susanna, mentioned by Cornelius de Bie in Het Golden Cabinet, 1662, and seen in Antwerp by the Swedish architect Nicodemus Tessin in 1687, was owned by the Genoese Don Estevan d'Andrea, Admiral of the River Scheldt, merchant banker, art collector, and consul general of the Genoese nation in Antwerp. The Susanna recorded in Rumour's villa in Naples in 1630, he died in 1674, is recorded alongside a Saint Sebastian by Van Dyck, and this has not been published before. Saint Sebastian is the Roman Christian martyr reputed to have saved Rome from the plague. In the Alta Pinakothek, there is a Saint Sebastian bound for martyrdom by Van Dyck, often thought to represent a self-portrait of Van Dyck himself, which has the same size and the same provenance as that of the Susanna, in that they were both in the collection of the Elector Palatine Johann Wilhelm, who ruled between 1690 and 1716. They hung in the Dusseldorf Gallery as pendants, as recorded in the 1778 catalogue, which gives the intriguing impression of a semi-naked but virtuous Anthony Van Dyck opposite a semi-naked but chaste Theresia Shirley. In conclusion, the web around the Spanish match is a tangle weave of Catholics, converts, collectors, and connoisseurs, all acting as royal diplomats. And somewhere in this web is a young Van Dyck. Whilst we have been able to make new findings about Van Dyck's stay in Rome and the paintings that he executed in Rome, we do of course still miss any mention of Van Dyck himself having visited Madrid. Though, if it ever emerges again, I for one would certainly like to see the Grisaille painting attributed to Van Dyck, which was sold at Christie's in London on the 30th of June 1827, which was described as King Charles I at the court of Madrid, a masterly sketch in chiaroscuro, including the portrait of the artist Van Dyck. Thank you very much for your attention.